All right, well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here. My name is Stephen Kokx, and I'm a journalist at LifeSite News. Most people, when they think of LifeSite News, think of John Henry Weston. They don't think of me at all, and that's completely fine. It's a lesson in humility. But I've been at LifeSite for 6 years now. Before I was at LifeSite, I was a community college instructor in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So just across the lake here, not too far from you all. So if you do want me to talk for 2 hours, we can do that for sure. But I think that'd be a bit too much pedance, I think. So we'll keep it short and sweet. We'll get to the Q&A, I think, fairly soon. Thank you for the lesser. Do you know who the lesser is when I say that? Brad, thank you for Brad for getting me here and for pushing this and for having me to come. Of course, I'm talking about tonight my book, St. Alphonsus for the 21st Century, a handbook for holiness, so I'll be referencing that throughout the night. I do have copies over here for sale later. But given that we're on a campus and given that I used to teach for quite a few years, I want to start with a little bit of pop quiz. It's not graded though, won't hold you to it, but I want to read something and see if you guys can guess who said this. Okay. All the human science and prudence that there is cannot extricate the church from the present state of relaxation and confusion in which every section finds itself. The all-powerful arm of God is necessary. As regards the bishops, very few of them possess genuine zeal for souls. Almost all religious communities are relaxed. This is the most important part, I think. The Pope should use particular diligence in his choice of bishops, since it is on them that the service of God and the salvation of souls mainly depends. He should pay great attention to informing himself beforehand about the moral conduct. Now, who do you think wrote that? Shout it out if you have an idea. Any ideas? St. Alphonsus, yes, our dear St. Alphonsus. He was born in 1696, died 1787, so several hundred years ago. We tend to think that the church in previous centuries was much better, but I think it's obvious this sort of remark from St. Alphonsus gives us a good lens to understand how he viewed the church in his own times, as well as I think it's very applicable today, obviously, with everything going on, as Father mentioned in his sermon today. So we'll do a couple of things tonight. First, we'll talk about who St. Alphonsus was as a person, what made him unique, what his family life was like growing up, what he taught, why he's a saint. Why do we have to bring St. Alphonsus back to the modern times? Why not somebody else? I'll clarify that. Secondly, what did he teach? More specifically about spirituality, about the church in his own time. He wrote over 110 books, not just on his own. He had a team of individuals helping him out. He didn't write his first until he was 47. He lived till he was 90. So, 110 books in 40-some years is quite the accomplishment. There are some who say he's actually the most accomplished author, best-selling author of all time, given the number of books he's written and the number of volumes and translations that have been done with his writings. So something to keep in mind when we talk about St. Alphonsus. So we'll talk about Liguori spirituality, which is generally what the term is to describe his spiritual teachings. And we'll talk about prayer and silence, because St. Alphonsus talks a lot about silence. And we'll just do another sort of quick poll here. Hands up if we have a smartphone and we check that smartphone at least 10 times a day. Show of hands real quick, don't be shy. 10 times. Okay, that's pretty simple. How about 20 times? Oh, good for you guys, that's pretty good. There was a study out of the UK not long ago that the average British adult spends 34 years of their life on their smartphones or devices or tablets or something to that effect. Sometimes, in other words, screen time. Okay, 34 years. Now, that's a lot of years that we could be spent in prayer with God, and St. Alphonsus talks about silence and putting away those sorts of things. I think if he was alive today, he would very much say, put those phones away. We'll also clarify what he taught about the priesthood, especially. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in these times about what it means to be a priest, what a priest is. Just a couple weeks ago, I was at my uncle's funeral, and he died of leukemia. He was only 60, so his name's David, if you could pray for him. But I was at the funeral, and the priest who gave some remarks, wasn't wearing his cassock. He was a retired priest, and I went up to him. I said, "Father, what gives? Where's the cassock?" And he said, "Well, people interact. They behave differently when they're around me, and I have the cassock on." I said, "Well, shouldn't they? I mean, you're an altus Christus. There's a sort of gravitas that comes with being a priest." He says, "Well, we're all really the same." And I said, "Well, Father, you can forgive sins. I can't do that." And he said, "Well, God forgives sins." I said, "Father, I can't forgive sins." And it was a little bit of a battle, but the point was made, and I think that's important. There's one thing that St. Alphonsus, I hope if he read the book, that would be most impressed with the chapter on the priesthood and religious life as well. So it's really important that we rediscover the priesthood, because as we all know, there is a synod going on right now, and at that synod in Rome, laypersons have been given the same amount of power in terms of voting as bishops, the shepherds of the church. So I'm convinced St. Alphonsus will not be in favor of that. But lastly, we'll talk about other topics as well: family life, prayer, silence, the Blessed Virgin Mary, scruples. St. Alphonsus suffered from scruples very much throughout his life. He also had a bit of a temper. We'll talk about that too. But I hope that's a good layout for the evening, and hopefully that's agreeable to you all. But before we get into that, because I've been asked this question a lot, I was asked this question by Tom on the chatter. Why St. Alphonsus? Why not St. Augustine for the 21st century? Or why not any other church father in our times? And it really goes back to the fact that when I was in college, 18, 19, 20 years old, I'd grown up Catholic. I went to Catholic grade school, high school, college. And that first semester away, not having that parental pressure or friends asking, "Hey, do you want to go to Mass this evening, Sunday night?" Usually was when I would go. Without that support system, I said, I'm not going to go. I have better things to do. The Novus Ordo liturgy growing up that I went to, we had priests walking up and down the aisles. We had guitars, all these sorts of things that were very unappealing. Didn't speak to at least myself. And so only after a couple of years did I say, okay, maybe I need to get back into a spiritual life. So helps from a lot of friends and family. I came to understand there was a great need to do that. And so after working at the Archdiocese of Chicago, just down the road here, when I was going to grad school at Loyola, and I was working for Cardinal George, and I moved back to Grand Rapids to be an instructor at several community colleges. And a friend of mine, we moved in together, and he had a stack of books, about a foot tall, all reprints from St. Alphonsus. And I wanted to grow deeper in my faith, and I said, I've never read St. Alphonsus before. Seems interesting. And within a matter of weeks, a lot of really strange things happened at the house we were living at. There was a DVD player in the living room that would open and close despite the power being off. In my bedroom, one Lent, this was about maybe 12 years ago now, the blinds on my window would like flicker up and down, like someone was running their finger up and down them. There was a temperature drop at random times throughout the day. My rosary would end up on the other side of the room. When I woke up in the morning, it was somewhere else. So there's a lot of really strange things happening. So we actually had a priest come and do a sort of exorcism, and everything stopped after that. But I think it was St. Alphonsus, the devil knowing what St. Alphonsus wanted to do, ultimately, obviously, bring me here today and to write the book. But it's really a gift back to him and to our Blessed Mother to say thank you for what you did to me to get me back on my feet and going back to church and understanding spirituality more. I think there's a lot of parallels between St. Alphonsus' time and our own. St. Alphonsus founded the Redemptorist Order in 1732 for the most abandoned souls in the Kingdom of Naples. He was Italian, and he wanted to go preach to those who are in the villages, the peasants, the farmers, the really simple people who did not have a lot of attention being paid to them. I think the obvious parallel to that in these times is that we are in many ways abandoned by our shepherds. They're attacking the traditional Latin Mass. They're not feeding us the traditional spirituality that I think St. Alphonsus provides us. So I think it's most appropriate that he re-injects himself into the life of the church in these times. So a couple preliminary remarks about why St. Alphonsus was someone I wanted to write about. But like I said earlier, let's talk about firstly who St. Alphonsus is. Who was he? Why is he important to know again? He was born in 1696, died 1787. So if you're a good historian, you'll realize that George Washington was alive at that time. Benjamin Franklin was alive at that time. The American Revolutionary War was happening at that time. So really interesting to think if those individuals ever got together and had something to talk about. But St. Alphonsus was the first child, the eldest boy, one of 7, to Don Giuseppe Liguori, or Joseph, and Anna Catherine Cavalieri. She was a Spaniard. 2 of St. Alphonsus' brothers, so he had, again, 6 siblings. 2 of his brothers went into the priesthood, one a Benedictine, the other became a diocesan priest. 2 sisters became nuns as well. His youngest brother, and I like to say this a lot, his name was Hercules, but that's not how you pronounce it. It's called Hercule, So he was the brother he was closest to. So interesting little fun fact. Growing up, St. Alphonsus' parents groomed him to be part of the nobility. They were part of the middle nobility in the Kingdom of Naples. Italy had not yet been unified yet. There was the Kingdom of Naples, and Italy, the Papal States were to the north. So something to think about there is St. Alphonsus, he received lessons in drawing. He was an excellent harpsichordist. I'm not sure if we have any musicians in the room tonight. I certainly am not. He went to the theater to listen to music. He would take off his glasses. So like me, he wore glasses. And he would go listen to the music. He loved music. Throughout his life, he composed over 50 hymns. There's one, in fact, called From Starry Skies Thou Comest. Okay, if you Google that, YouTube that, it'll come up. Andrea Bocelli, the famous Italian singer, he sings that at Christmas time every Christmas. So it's still a famous song, and St. Alphonsus is to thank for that. So his parents gave him a variety of tutors and private instructors. He took retreats with his father at with the Vincentians, with the Jesuits, as well as with the Oratorians. And so he received his canon law as well as civil law degree at 16. So I don't know about you, but when I was 16, I was playing high school football, not studying canon law. So it's an interesting upbringing that he had. Like I said, he appreciated music, but he also appreciated silence as well. We'll talk about that a bit later. But what changed for St. Alphonsus was after he was 26 years old, he had a very successful legal career. It's believed he didn't lose a single case. When he was 26, he was involved in a land dispute with the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Okay. For those historians, again in the room, the Medici name might sound familiar. Okay. St. Alphonsus was involved in this land dispute with multi-millions of dollars, and he prepared for months on end for the case. His opponents were of the Medici representatives. He prepared exceptionally well. Generally, it's thought that he oversaw a detail in the case and that he had made a mistake or something, but more recent scholarship suggests that's not actually what happened, and that the judge was bribed, go figure, with the Medicis, by a pair of bears, of all things, a male and female performing bear of sorts. So this is what triggered St. Alphonsus to go into the priesthood. He came to understand. He ran basically out of the courtroom and said, "World, I know thee now, you'll never see me again." So within days, he went to Our Lady of Ransom. It's a church that's still around in the Naples area. And he laid his sword, okay, which back then was a sign of your nobility. He laid his sword on Our Lady's altar and said, I give myself to you, make me your son. And from there, he set off to become a priest. So interesting little story there. It shows, I think, obviously, how God sometimes uses what might seem harsh or injustice to put someone on the right path. So the next 3 years, he lived at his father's house. His father was very much opposed to him becoming a priest. His father wanted him to be this lawyer who would bring the family fame and prestige. But he had to relent to that. St. Alphonsus lived at his parents' house for 3 years. He had already had exceptional formation. He did not need a long time to become a priest. So he started off in the area of Naples. He wanted to actually go to China, of all places. There was a local priest who had done missions in China at the time, and there was a Chinese college, is what it was called, and he wanted to go to the Far East and actually experience what that was like. But turns out God had other plans for him. Despite setting up evening chapels, so events like this in the evening for laity, as well as preaching on street corners, he would visit the sick as well. But the change sort of came about a year and a half, a couple years into his priesthood in 1731. And, there's a lot of talk, again, at the synod. I bring this up because it's unfortunately the case that the Catholic Church gets a bad rap in regards to women religious, female vocations, nuns, sisters, and things like this. But we can thank a nun, a woman, for, indirectly at least, for founding the Redemptorist Order, which is the order St. Alphonsus founded. And the story goes like this. So Sister Maria Celeste Crostarosa, she was Italian, she had a spiritual advisor called Father Thomas Falcoya. Okay, so he was in the Naples area at the time. And she had visions about founding a female order. And she told Father Falcoya about them, and he had a bit of a strong reaction to them. He didn't necessarily agree with them right away. It took several years for him to actually come to sort of agree with them. Once he finally settled on pursuing the visions further, he delegated, actually, who this time then Father Alphonsus. He was only two or 3 years into his priesthood. He said, Father Alphonsus, go look into this, see what you can find. If it's interesting, see what you make of it. Okay. So Father Alphonsus goes, and he spends a month with the nuns, and within a couple weeks after that, the matter is resolved, the rule is settled, and the nuns begin to take their vows. So St. Alphonsus, one of the first things he does is he sets up a women religious organization called the Redemptorist Nuns. But God was not done with Sister Celeste or Father Alphonsus. Sister Celeste had more visions. At this time, it was actually of Father Alphonsus himself, speaking with Christ. And now when that was made known to Father Falcoya, who again also had some spiritual advice for St. Alphonsus privately too, it was a bit of a thing that St. Alphonsus struggled with a lot. He reached out to many priests to say, what is going on here? What should I do? The Chinese college was saying, this isn't right. We have enough missionary groups to go out into the countryside. We don't need another. And so there's a lot of issues there. But in 1732, a year later, the Redemptorists were started. And again, their mission is to preach to the most abandoned souls, those who are most forgotten. And there was less than a dozen companions, 6 of them, I think, at the time when it started. And within 6 months, all of them, except one lay brother, abandoned St. Alphonsus. So not an easy start for him, but an interesting beginning nonetheless. Later in life, he became a bishop. He would get kicked out of the Redemptorist Order before he would die. We can talk about that in the Q&A. It's interesting, but sort of an excommunication, a little white martyrdom for St. Alphonsus at the end of his life. So, all right. So Liguorian spirituality. What is Liguorian spirituality? What are the key parts of St. Alphonsus' spiritual teachings? How can those help us in our times in the church in the 21st century? St. Alphonsus' core teachings comes from what he defines as perfection. What is perfection? He says, uniting our will to God's will. Simple, very simple, but a very complex answer. What is God's will? How do we unite our will to God's will? How do we know if God's angry with me? If I'm having a hard time praying, does that mean God's angry with me? St. Alphonsus says a couple things to get us on this road to perfection, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes here. So, the first thing he says, perfection consists in obedience to your spiritual director. So, your priest in the confessional. He says, obedience in this manner is the handing over of your will, which he calls the head of the soul, okay, to your spiritual director. He says doing that is actually more, in a sense, more beloved by God than physical martyrdom. Because physical martyrdom, you're giving the head of your body, your physical body to God, obviously for the faith, but he says, again, handing over the will, which is the head of the soul, to your spiritual director, and following that promptly, that's perfection. That's a very important thing to St. Alphonsus is obedience. But he says there's other ways we can know God's will as well. First thing he says is don't complain. Pretty simple. But about what? First he says don't complain about the weather. It's not easy here in Wisconsin or in Michigan. But temperature, coldness, that's God's will. First thing to do. Second is your health. St. Alphonsus is not opposed to being in shape, seeking remedies for ailments, things like this. He's not saying put yourself in situations where you're suffering. But he does say, if you've got the scans done, you go to your doctors. God might be wanting you to go through this. Accept that, offer it up as Christ did on the cross. Christ didn't complain on the cross, St. Alphonsus says. Thirdly, St. Alphonsus says to seek perfection, don't complain about your physical appearance or talents. If someone who else is out there might have better looks or more talents or has written more books or any number of things, St. Alphonsus says you don't know if you would have those same talents and skills and things like that, what you would do with it. Thank God that he's given you what you have. He also says to be perfect, to unite our wills to God's will, to know your dominant faults. And everyone's going to have different dominant faults. Everyone's going to have different struggles in their lives. These are the things we struggle with the most. So for some people, it's sloth. Some people, it's impurity, gluttony, gossip, maybe. These are the 3 or 4 sins we generally struggle with the most of our lives. And St. Alphonsus, like I said, was not immune to having dominant faults. He had a bit of a temper. He had scruples. So scruples, I'm presuming most of us know what that is. It's sort of a paranoia about sin lurking around every corner. That, a thought popped into my head. Have I sinned just by the thought being there? No. St. Alphonsus had to work to overcome this a lot. And he wrote thousands of letters, so the equivalent of like emails today. And you can read them online. A lot of them are in ebooks now. And one biographer said of them that when you read them in totality, he was always kind, patient, generous, and always very caring towards everyone he ever wrote a letter to. So for someone who had a bit of a temper, that's a great thing that we can look to in him in overcoming that. To further perfect ourselves, St. Alphonsus says we need to do a couple more things, though. He says to perform acts of good self-love and to replace good self-love, replace bad self-love with good self-love. In other words, when we put our will ahead of God's through any number of sins, if it's maybe love of money, love of human respect, any number of things, gluttony, food, these forms of bad self-love get in our way from uniting ourselves with God. And so St. Alphonsus says we have to avoid all avoidable occasions of sin. So he makes 2 distinctions here, right? There's avoidable occasions of sin and there's unavoidable occasions of sin. Okay? There are some things in life we can't avoid. Going to the grocery store, family get-togethers, things like this for holidays. But it's the unavoidable ones that we have to really get out of our lives, going to certain places on Friday nights and other things. St. Alphonsus also says we have to offer up mortifications, both physical, by denying ourselves, our body, what it wants, as well as interior mortifications. So what he's saying there is humility, not giving into human respect, being willing to be looked down upon and say, I'm fine with that. In fact, when St. Alphonsus was a priest, he was known to actually wear a large chain around his neck when he ate food. And he also would put bitter herbs on his meals to make sure that they weren't as delectable to him. So he always tried to deny his palate. If you want to take it to the extreme, I guess you could put like salsa in your cereal or something. I don't know, but it's obviously an attempt to deny your palate something enjoyable, right? So something to think about. One last point about Liguorian spirituality, then we'll talk about the priesthood, and we'll have some short remarks on family life. So what about St. Alphonsus' aspects? What does he teach on prayer? He says, if we don't pray, we can't know God. No one can be saved if they don't pray. Love of God is at the center of his spirituality. And when we pray, we reciprocate that love. And he says, there's 3 ways we know God loves us, or how God manifests his love for us. First is when creation. St. Alphonsus says, look around the world. Look at the sun, the stars, animals, vegetation. God made all of that for mankind. He made it for you. Okay? Embrace that. Thank him for that. Secondly, God loves us, he says, through the redemption, through Christ dying on the cross. As we know from Scripture, there's no greater love that a man has until when he lays down his life for his friends. Then thirdly, St. Alphonsus says God shows his love for us by sending the Holy Spirit after Christ ascends into heaven. So when we understand that, St. Alphonsus says we should approach prayer and time with God as a friend with whom we can dialogue with, who we can share our concerns with, who we can ask for things from, and share our doubts and worries about too. So he says, don't approach God as if he's just high and mighty and isn't relatable. He says, make him relatable. He is our friend. And he says further, when we pray, we're not in the business of prayer to get consolations out of it, to get warm and fuzzy feelings. Sometimes God doesn't send those. He says, that's fine. Our business in prayer is to petition, to thank, to adore, to ask God for things, and to glorify him because, again, he loves us with creation. He died for us, and he sent his Holy Spirit after dying for us. So St. Alphonsus says we have to keep that in mind. I think this will be most important for the people in this room. A lot of family advice St. Alphonsus has as well about people who are seeking prayer, because when I talk to parents who are saying, well, how can I pray better? I have 5, 6 kids, 7 kids, and it's not always easy. St. Alphonsus says a couple things. First, he says, to preserve the spirit of prayer, there is 3 things necessary: solitude, silence, and the presence of God. So solitude, silence, and the presence of God. Solitude, he says, there's 2 sorts of solitude. Solitude of the heart and solitude of the body, so physical solitude. Anyone can go run off in a desert, right? That's solitude of the body, of physical solitude. And St. Alphonsus recommends that. He says, if you can, deny yourself your surroundings. Go to a place where you can focus on God. He says, 15 minutes in adoration in front of our Lord in the Eucharist you'll get more out of that than any other thing you do in your spiritual life. So I'm presuming there's an adoration chapel or upstairs. We have that here, so it's a good thing. But second, he says about silence, silence around our surroundings. And then thirdly, the presence of God. So it's hard when you have 5, 6, 7 children. That's a great thing. If you can't make it to adoration, if you can't find physical solitude, St. Alphonsus says, find the solitude of the heart, rather. So the presence of God always being around you. Wherever you go, imagine Christ is actually with you, and speak to him as a friend, okay? So solitude, silence, the presence of God. Good to keep in mind. And just a quick story on that point. When I first read solitude and prayer and silence when I was in my late 20s, I was a community college instructor. At night, I would drive home from class, teaching night classes, 9, 10 o'clock. The day was over, and I wanted to just kind of zone out. The day is over. I want to listen to some music. And I started to realize, though, that those are some precious moments when that's real silence can happen and speak to God. And so in that 15-minute drive home, I would just turn off the car radio, began to pray, would also listen to Gregorian chant, Latin hymns, things like this. And I think it's a valuable lesson that I mentioned in the book as well about silence. Where in your day-to-day life can you find more silence? Because you can't be friends with someone you don't talk to. Basic, simple human thing. And you can't be friends with God if you don't talk to him. So I think that's a very practical thing that people could actually do. So we'll touch on the priesthood real quick, and then a couple of general points about some other topics he's taught about, and then we'll get into the Q&A. St. Alphonsus says the priesthood, the office of the priesthood, and this goes into my comments earlier on the synod. St. Alphonsus says the priesthood makes priests greater than not only the angels, but also the Blessed Virgin Mary. That's a big claim. Now, why would that be the case? He gives two reasons. One is priests can forgive sins, something Mary can't, something angels can't. And they can confect the sacrament of a Lord at the Mass. Angels can't do that. Mary can't do that. St. Alphonsus says that the offering that priests give to God in the Mass is greater than any other offering that is this side of Christ's own death. It has infinite value. Okay. Personally, when I first read that, I had thought of the term clericalism. We hear a lot about clericalism and rigidity in the church today. But I think the overemphasis in the opposite direction is this sort of egalitarian, sort of democratic church where everything's flattened, right? Everyone's equal. But St. Alphonsus is saying, no, there is inequality here. And it's because of what the priest does in the Mass and in the confessional. I think if he was around today, he would very much be opposed to many things that are going on. So he would also say, this is a second point on this, he said, like pastor, like parish. Okay? Like pastor, like parish. So when we see a church universal, divorce rates similar to non-Catholics, when we see support for various forms of illicit unions, when we see Catholics not attending Mass anymore. I think using St. Alphonsus' reasoning, the answer as to why that's happening is pretty obvious. It's because we have priests who don't know what the priesthood is and what they're supposed to be doing in the confessional, at the pulpit, and elsewhere throughout the parish life. You are all very fortunate here to have the priest you do. Obviously, the fruits are there. So cling to your priests here. St. Alphonsus says, bad preachers and bad confessors are the ruin of the world. Something startling to think about. Just a couple closing remarks. We'll get to the Q&A. I'm hoping you'll have quite a few. He does talk about family life quite a bit. Like I said, his brother Hercule was his youngest brother. He was closest with him. And they talked about a lot of things. He actually encouraged his daughter, so his niece, to enter the convent later in life. St. Alphonsus says to parents, always begin and end the day with your children by firstly in the morning by thanking God for getting through the night and offering up everything you'll do throughout the day. At night, end with the rosary or a recollection about what transpired, asking forgiveness for sins. St. Alphonsus especially has writings on fathers. He says fathers need to check in with their children. Don't let them be exposed to certain situations. He mentions bad books at his time. Now I think it's probably bad social media platforms, right? Which I think he would very much say parents need to do a much better job at that. In one frightening remark, he does say parents will be held accountable for the sins of their children. Okay? And to dissuade a child from having a vocation, he says is a double sin. It's a sin against piety as well as a sin against charity. It's a lot there, I know, to think about that. But St. Alphonsus, again, he went on retreats with his own father in his teens. His father tried to persuade him to not become a priest. And in fact, when he did decide to become a priest, he wanted to make him a diocesan priest, or at least push him towards the diocese, because he wanted him to become a bishop later in life. His father was a bit ambitious, but later in life he did die. He actually wanted to become a brother of the Redemptorist because he sort of amended his life later on, understood the greatness that his son was and became. and he thanked his son for becoming the great priest and bishop that he was. So some stern words for families he did have. Death. He says a lot about death and sin. I'll keep it short. He says, God counts not the years of our lives, but the number of sins we've committed. And he says, we don't know if the next one is the one that kind of pushes God. He says when God's mercy is at an end, his justice kicks in. Now, he makes that remark in the context of unrepentant sinners. He says God always is ready and willing to forgive those who come back to him. Right? So, dominant faults, things we struggle with throughout our life, St. Alphonsus says, continue on. Don't be too worried if you've committed a sin that you've committed over and over again. He says, to lament and to dwell on a sin is an act of pride. He says, get to the confessional, humble yourself, and start over. Okay. The death of a saint is not death, but sleep. He says. Sleep, we should look forward to death with great joy, because it's a time when we can unite ourselves to Christ's suffering on the cross. So those last moments in life, we should cherish them, because that's the time most when our suffering is going to be closest to Christ. So I think that's really, really important. And I make the point in the book, I think, in our time, we get visited by hospice workers and others who want to make our exit from this life comfortable. But in my view, obviously I'm saying this as a young man who's not there yet, but I would hope that I can use those moments to offer up that suffering for Christ in those last moments, and not tranquilized by any sort of drugs. A moment to reflect on Mary for about 3 minutes here, then we'll open up to Q&A. St. Alphonsus was what you might call a Marian maximalist. He wrote The Glories of Mary. It's his most well-known book, one of his most well-known books. It's over 600 pages. And he has a lot to say about Mary. He had visions of Mary throughout his life, especially on his deathbed. When he was giving a sermon on her at one point, he levitated off the ground. Everyone attested to that fact. He saw her in a cave when he was a young priest in Naples. He fasted on Saturdays in Mary's honor, and did that throughout his life. He said when the Redemptorists would go on missions, so Redemptorists historically would give parish missions. I'm not sure if any of us here remember those from years gone by, but Redemptorists would go to a chapel, a church, for sometimes weeks and months and preach about various topics. Typically, they'll preach about the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. But St. Alphonsus said the most edifying one that he always saw was when they preached about Mary. And he always understood that Mary, even before the church declared she was immaculately conceived without original sin, again, he's writing in the 1730s, 1740s. He defended that doctrine ahead of time, because it just made perfect sense that, as he said, God would not create a home, he's referring to Mary's womb, hand it over to the devil before allowing his son to inhabit it. In other words, he would not create the womb of Mary to be tainted by original sin, because that's where Christ is going to physically dwell on earth. And he has a lot more to say about Mary. He talks about her being our spiritual mother. If Christ was obedient to Mary during his life, then we need to be obedient to and put ourselves under her protection as well. So he had a lot to say about Mary, but 600 pages is not so easy to distill in about 2 minutes here. So we can talk about that in the Q&A. But I think that's good for now. I hope you have some questions. We've talked about St. Alphonsus, who he was, what he did, his family life, his upbringing, some of his spirituality, and then a little bit on Mary and family life at the end. So feel free to fire away, and I'll hopefully answer anything you might have. So. Right. Question? Hi.
Thank you. I understand that Alphonse Liguori had sciatica at the end of his life and had to be carried around. Is that correct?
Yeah, so actually about the last 10 years of his life, he was in a wheelchair. His back was so curved that they say his neck was sort of going into his chest. And he is the arthritis saint, so if you have arthritis, pray to him for that. And he suffered many physical ailments at the end of his life. It's in the book. There's actually prayers to St. Alphonsus at the back if you have health issues like that, and he's definitely one to pray to for that. Yeah.
Okay. Have you heard about the Society of St. Alphonse Liguori Chiropractors?
No. Fascinating.
Now you have. Okay, great. Thank you.
Tell us more. Who are they?
Well, it's... It's a new organization, so...
Okay. Wonderful.
I do have an embarrassing story to tell you about. I love St. Alphonse Liguori, and I have for the longest time, and I've read many of his books. And I would be too embarrassed to share this story with this group because it'll be on the internet, but I will tell you later about... Yeah, okay.
Great, thank you. Good.
How did he get kicked out of his own order?
Great question, thank you. So at the time, the Redemptorist Order was started in 1732. And again, Italy had not yet been unified, so there was the Papal States to the north, the Kingdom of Naples to the south. And the Redemptorists were approved, I think it was Clement, I forget which pope it was. They were approved in the Papal States, and as well as in Naples, or not yet in Naples. And so Alphonsus, at the point when they tried to get it approved, because things were sort of different back then. Like the king of Naples had a bit more power as to saying who and what orders would be recognized in the kingdom. You could operate sort of under the radar, but there were benefits that came with state approval. And what happened was there were several younger priests who, with Alphonsus' approval, took on the initiative to get it approved in the Kingdom of Naples. But unfortunately, Alphonsus was quite a bit old at the time. He was in his 80s. He died when he was 90. And the two priests that went to the King of Naples, to the royal court, in other words, to get approval, they sort of succumbed to the demands of certain individuals there. And they had changed the rule. And so when they brought it back to St. Alphonsus, who by then couldn't see very well at all, who was a bit maybe too trusting on certain matters, they got his signature. He did not read it all, so he didn't understand the breadth of the changing of the rule. And so when this was submitted, or when this became known, the Pope heard about it. Other members of the Redemptorists heard about it. And as far as they understood, they saw St. Alphonsus' signature on it. And they said, hey, he's trying to change the rules. He wants to appease the king and the royal court. When the facts were the opposite, and he basically had been deceived. But despite his appeals to the Vatican, he'd only been to the Vatican one time in his whole life, physically there. The Pope actually cited, they said this is enough. We've heard enough. It had gone on for several years. And Alphonsus was basically removed as the superior of the order. He died outside of the order officially, canonically. He was restored, I believe, not long after his death. One interesting fact is he bilocated to the death of the Pope who actually kicked him out. I think that's a fact. I have to double check. I think that's true. But he did bilocate to one Pope at the time who was dying. I think it's the same one. So a little chicanery there for sure. It wasn't anything of his own, maliciousness or anything like that. But it's an interesting fact. It's sort of white martyrdom, I think, for St. Alphonsus, for sure. So it's a great question. A lot of intrigue there, I think, in the history of the Redemptorists.
Did he deny absolution to the Pope when he bilocated?
Say that again?
Did he deny absolution to the Pope?
Did he deny absolution? I don't know. I don't think he did. He would probably be humble enough to say, whatever you need me to do. So, yeah, it's a great question.
I think you would be remiss to not mention the Our Lady of Perpetual Help
Yeah, sure.
about and the connection with Alphonsus Liguori. So if you want to just say a few words.
Yeah, so in the 1860s, this was Blessed Pius IX, who was the one who declared St. Alphonsus an actual doctor of the church. He entrusted the icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help to the Redemptorists, and they actually have the original icon at the Church of St. Alphonsus in the Vatican. St. Alphonsus obviously had a great devotion to Mary. The Church of Our Lady of Ransom, like I said before, is where he laid down his sword for her at her altar. He did a number of things for her. Again, his book, Glories of Mary, sort of explains his whole view. He goes through the Salve Regina prayer, line by line, explaining that, and how Mary is our perpetual help. So he says, seek her at all times. And he was a Marian maximalist, like I said. So I'm not sure if there's any more you wanted to add to that, or if you had any more interesting facts about it. But it was very much a good thing. They are she is the protector of the current Redemptorist order. So that is a good fact to know as well for us today. So if you have Alphonsan spirituality inclinations, or if you're a devotee to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, that is something that St. Alphonsus would very much support.
I would just like to put a plug in for a TAN publishing book. I don't know the name of it because I gave my copy to Thomas Nelson in Rockford before they moved to out on the East Coast. But I used this little book by TAN, and it was a compilation of great facts about the Blessed Virgin from the writings of Alphonsus Liguori, and I used them on First Saturday, and I would take just a snippet and before each one of the decades. And the book starts out something like, if Christ is the king, then Mary is the queen. And and all of the statements in this book are just, simple, straightforward, bam-o, and a punch. So I don't know the name of the book, but it's put out by... No, it's not the Glory. The Glories of Mary is like 600 pages. So, but speaking of the Glories of Mary, I will share the embarrassing story. As I went to Palmer, I'm a chiropractor. One of my very good friends was a Jew, and we spent a lot of time together. And he was non-practicing, and I told him, I says, look, you need to honor God, and you should do it either as a Jew or you should acknowledge Christ as the Messiah. And because I've been enamored with Alphonsus Liguori, I gave him 2 books by Alphonsus Liguori, The Glories of Mary, and I forget what the other one was, but one's like 600 pages and the other's 300 pages, and this guy doesn't even know who Jesus Christ is. And I'm like, and reflecting years later, I'm like, sheesh, start off with soup, not steak. Anyways, okay, yeah. Thank you.
One quick comment on that is St. Alphonsus calls Mary the moon, whereas Christ is the sun, bright. Mary reflects. She's lesser illumination, but she's the highest in heaven, second to God. And he also calls her the neck of the mystical body of Christ. So it's beautiful analogies that anyone can go to, for sure. Thank you for sharing.
So I just wanted to ask, we've talked about its spirituality, and I know you've got some of that in your book, and it's kind of I don't know if Cliff Notes but because there's so much there, but what would be the text if you wanted to have St. Alphonsus as a spiritual guide?
There's a couple. Uniformity with God's Will. It's about a 30-page pamphlet. It's really short and simple. That's most of what my first chapter sort of pulls from, this idea of perfection, of uniting our wills to God's will. There's, I saw upstairs, Visits to the Blessed Sacrament. That's essential for Alphonsan spirituality. Again, St. Alphonsus says you'll get more out of 15 minutes in adoration than anything else you'll do. And he says it's because it's the King of the universe right there in front of you. I mean, he makes the point that kings, governors, in our time we'd say presidents, parliamentarians, house speakers, they charge a lot of money just to get a photo op with you, right? A handshake and that's it. But St. Alphonsus says it's the King of the universe right there. You can say anything you want with him. So those are two really simple ones. There are some shorter versions of Glories of Mary, though. You can find, I think, America Needs Fatima has a book on Mary from him called Glories of Mary. It's really short. And those are good introductory ones as well, I think. But obviously, I think this one might help too. So, yeah.
What's the non-introductory one? Is there a non-introductory one?
There's, you can get a lot of these books online with PDFs these days, ebooks, and they're free. The Way of Perfection and Salvation, I think, is one. If you want to read about the priesthood, there's the Duties and Dignities of the Priest. That's another 600-page book. There's one called The True Spouse of Christ. This is for young women especially. It's really just for nuns, for how to perfect themselves in the convent. He has a book on, the Sermons of St. Alphonsus for the year. It's a big red book by Tan. That's always a good one to read, every Sunday after Mass. There's more. I mentioned them in the introduction of my book, if I could find the page here. But yeah, it's not hard to find his writings online. I mean, they're all ebooks now. They're all scanned. A lot of them are free. The matter comes down to, do you have time to read 600 pages? Or just, a couple. It's not always easy, I think. So, but so like I said, St. Alphonsus, he says, I never preached a sermon that the little old lady in the back of the church didn't understand. So his writing style is very similar to that. So everything he wrote was very simple, very straightforward. And I try to do that in my book too. So it's a good question. Yes, Father?
So you started at the beginning, you said that he was into preaching to the people who were not typically preached to.
Yeah.
And that was, you kind of didn't mention after that anything about that. And that seems like a kind of like a huge aspect, or at least if that is an identifying aspect, how does that translate into his spirituality?
Yeah, so at Naples at the time, there was several competing sort of missionary groups. There was the diocesan group called the Congregation for the Apostolic Missions, which is what he started out as, so just going into the general sort of field. There was the Oratorians were there. There were a couple other ones there. But I think his desire for those who are most abandoned came from, I think, his upbringing as being someone who had everything, who was part of the middle nobility, and he saw the lack. Well, I mean, really, it really comes down to the visions that Sister Celeste, Maria Celeste, had. I mean, she is, in a sense, those visions of God. The rule for the Redemptorist order was to preach to the most abandoned souls, and that attitude, the adoption of that attitude, was to go out to the peasants in the countryside, to go to the farmers who weren't very learned. And his father very much opposed that, in fact. His father somewhat meddled in his ministry. He tried to, at one point, nominate him to be a bishop. He eventually did become a bishop, but St. Alphonsus wrote back to him, will you just please knock it off? This is not appreciated. Because he wanted to go to the poor, because he understood, again, that it's the most abandoned souls that need support too. And his preaching style kind of goes into that. Like I said, he understood, at the time, actually, the preaching style was very long, very verbose, highly academic. Now, St. Alphonsus is someone who had tutors and civil law degrees at 16. He could have done that. But the practical aspects of the ministry, the reaching people where they are, understanding what can I work with here, okay? If you preach over their heads, nothing's going to get through. If you, don't have simple things for simple people, you're adulterating the Word of God. You're adulterating the gospel is basically what he said. And so I think after that, the Redemptorists spread throughout the kingdom for the next several decades. And it's the missions that really they specialized in. Like I said, they would preach about the four last things, very simple and really clearly. Was there anything more specific you wanted me to address about that, or was that kind of the gist of it?
I was in Spain, and what you realize is that Europe is like a little bit different than the United States because, well, especially now, because there's everything accessible. But you realize, like even like 50, 60 years ago, like there were a lot of people who just probably couldn't go to mass because the region we were at was as much more populated than Madison, but you'd have your town, and the towns are populous, and then there's like this whole countryside between the towns.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have, I don't know how anybody went to mass in the town.
Yeah.
And I doubt there were any like missions like for those people. So is that what you're talking about? Or
Yeah.
you're talking about
Exactly.
is that his spirituality, or is his spirituality going to like I don't know, like the bars or whatever, like where that kind of people?
No.
Is it about going out to
Yeah.
people who actually did? This happens in Ecuador now.
Yeah.
I know, because you have your parish, and then you have people who are
That's precisely it.
actual poor people who like don't have cars. And they just can't. Like this is growing all the time, and then they can't. So like our priests in Ecuador like realize, okay, you have to go to them.
Yeah.
They can't come to you.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Because one of the things, I mean, is that what he's talking about?
Mhm.
And if he is, like, how does that translate to our spiritual awareness of that?
Well, I would make the point, like I said at the beginning, I think, are we in a time where we've been abandoned, where we're not getting proper priests who understand what the priesthood is in our era? I think, where I live in Michigan, we have churches closing quite a bit, and there's a lack of vocations, and a lack of good vocations. And I think to get a priest who understands true spirituality, what the priesthood is, the truths of our faith. I mean, we have. So as a journalist, there was a story I wrote 2 weeks ago on the president of the Swiss Bishops' Conference, and he gave some remarks ahead of the synod, right? And he said we should have married women, or married priests, and women for priesthood. And that to me suggests that there's a poverty of tradition in the church, if you will. And there's not just that individual, but we're being left in the countrysides to fend for ourselves in many ways within the confines of the church. And that would be my insight, I think, for what St. Alphonsus provides in terms of a spirituality that's, I think, been lost. Because if you look at the number of Redemptorists in the church that still cling to St. Alphonsus' spirituality, one that I can think of is in Scotland. Do you know the Transalpine Redemptorists at all? They're a small community that they own their own island off the coast of Scotland, but they don't make many missions over here. We have a small missionary group of traditional Redemptorist priests in Michigan, but there's only 3 of them, and 2 of them are laymen, are studying to become, they're seminarians, studying to become priests. So these principles that he laid down on his missions and his spirituality are basically lost, I would argue. And that, in that sense, we're not getting what he taught that I thought was so efficacious to those souls in the Kingdom of Naples and throughout the world since until relatively recently when they were changed. So, yeah. It's a good question. Anyone else?
I don't know our saint that we're speaking of. We have a lot of his books. Fortunately, we got on garage sales. But to me, it's astonishing what our God has done through him. Just thinking about the mystical aspect, the touch of God upon a life of a person as such. And it's like, I just can't believe that we can all be sitting here and what God did with his life on the mystical level. And I was wondering, we have the Stations of the Cross, right? I just can't believe that version of the Stations of the Cross. It's very deeply touching, to say the least. And is there anything you can say about that moment in his life, what God gave him there?
Yeah, so what he's referring to is the popularity of St. Alphonsus' Stations of the Cross. It's still used throughout the world. It's one of his best-selling books, actually, aside from Visits to the Blessed Sacrament. I believe he wrote that actually fairly early on in his priestly mission. I think he wrote it more or less for his own priest, as a handbook, as a guide, in other words, to say this is what we're going to do. And the same thing goes with his book on visits to the Eucharist. It was intended for sort of internal use only, firstly, and then sort of gained wider variety or wider circulation after it had sort of spread. And again, he worked with a team of individuals. It wasn't just him cranking out 100 books in 40-some years. It was a number of his assistants, younger priests, seminarians as well, gathering a lot of the quotes and studying and putting things together for him. As anyone in that position does have that, that's very common. I think when you listen to, when you read those reflections on each of the stations, it gets down to, again, I think I didn't mention it in the talk tonight, his great emphasis on the Passion. He says, unlike today, St. Alphonsus is almost singularly focused in his spiritual writings on the Passion of Christ. He says, if you focus on the death of our Lord, especially his crucifixion, you won't sin. It's the solution and antidote to falling into occasions of sin and actual sin. So, when I read his reflections on the Passion, that comes through extremely well as Mary and everything else he says about our mother. I mean, the songs, the little rhymes at the bottom, the little hymns. It's all about Mary. So, it's a great book. I don't know if you use it here in Lent on Fridays or not, but it's my favorite version. I know Benedict XVI has one of his own. I think John Henry Newman did one. I'm sure there's more who did a Way of the Cross, but his is my favorite by far. And it's really small. It's really simple, straightforward. It's not complex. It doesn't take too long to do. So, yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
So if I could just say one more thing about Our Lady of Perpetual Help. So the Redemptorists sometimes have a parish here and there, even though they go out and give talks. And one of the things that they promote is this image of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And so usually within the parish, they will sell these pictures dirt cheap. They're beautifully framed. And when I was in Davenport, there used to be a parish there that was run by the Redemptorists. I don't know if it still is. I purchased a picture. It sat in my living room forever. It's in my office right now. But anyways, the picture should be a reflection of who you are as a Catholic. When someone walks into your house, they should know that they're walking into a Catholic house, that there's a crucifix or there's pictures. And so, you got it in your heart, it'll be on the wall. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Wonderful. Anything else? No? Okay. Well, I'll be over here if you want to buy a book or two. Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you. Hopefully you got something out of tonight. It was good to revisit my professor days, talking a little bit in front of people. So hope it wasn't too fast. too in depth, but thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure, and look forward to talking to you after. So thanks a lot.